My guest for this episode is Dr. Max Doshay. Max is the founder and CEO, co-founder and CEO of Monema Behavioral Health, which includes Monema Wellness Center for Women and Element Q Healing Center for LGBTQ folks. And I'm just going to start by, being funny. How did a straight guy like you start a women's program and an LGBTQ program?
Wonderful question. To say the least, I stick out a little bit at both. I'm the only man at Monema Wellness Center, and I'm only straight individual at Element Q Healing. Why is though, before getting into like the CEO side of things, I am technically a psychologist. I like to say I am a psychologist pretending to be a CEO. But when I used to run very traditional kind of dual diagnosis and addiction treatment centers, I used to have women come up to me a lot saying, "Hey Max, I don't feel comfortable processing my trauma here because a lot of my trauma involves men. Like, is there a gender specific kind of environment you could refer me to?" And be like, "Oh yeah, there should be. There definitely should be." That's a very obvious thing that women wouldn't want to process their trauma around men if their trauma involved men. So we'd look to refer them somewhere, and that place didn't exist. So it came to a spot where, you can complain about how something doesn't exist or you do it yourself. And we formed Monema Wellness Center as a result, a trauma-based, gender-specific treatment center for women. Off of that, though, we kind of had this interesting, similar journey with opening Element Q, in that we opened Monema Wellness Center, Women's Treatment Center, and we were treating non-binary individuals and trans women. And the experience of non-binary individuals and trans women is different than cisgender women. So we found that, we're giving these individuals probably like 80% what they need. Where could we find 100%, which is an LGBTQ plus specific mental health treatment center? And we were looking around in San Diego for that, and once again, it doesn't exist. So same kind of ethos. You can complain about it, or you do it yourself, and we formed Element Q Healing as a result, and that's how a straight dude becomes CEO of a women's and LGBTQ treatment center.
I love it. And maybe one day I'll convince you that we can open a men's program.
We're getting
So
there.
full transparency, I'm a partner and a co-founder of Element Q, because one of the reasons is because Max and I have worked together for many, many years. And your original founders, Nicole and Molly, and that trifecta, which is Monema. I love it. That's where the first two letters of your
Molly,
name.
Nicole, Max.
Molly, Nicole, Max. And
we were really lazy in naming it. It's like, let's just chop our name up.
It's actually brilliant. It wasn't lazy. I know it wasn't, but it's brilliant because once you get it, there's no other Monema. So I love that.
There is.
But I want to kind of lean in a little bit and talk about, the why for you, because I've worked in the field since 2008. And the reason that I felt so called to be partner with you in any way is the profound work that you were doing and the dedication that you were doing to helping people heal from trauma, not trauma informed, but trauma focused.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the big differentiation of trauma informed versus trauma focused. Informed just means I'm informed of the fact that trauma has an effect. And I do conduct myself in a certain fashion, but I'm doing my treatment and I'm informed that trauma is playing a part. Trauma focused is trauma is the beginning, middle, and end of what we're doing right now. And I'm very passionate about trauma focused treatment. That's why treatment centers I'm involved in, we really want to look at from every single angle of how can trauma show up. So we're big on how interior design could be triggering, how lighting could be triggering, how we talk to clients could be triggering, how we introduce ourselves to clients, how we can move about the space. Because, trauma shows up in really funky, indirect ways, and in ways that aren't necessarily conscious to the client themselves. So it's really, really important to take that 110%, kind of approach. Because when someone's coming into treatment for like severe PTSD, you really have to have every single box checked, because anything can kind of trigger and cause decompensation. And if you don't have it from every single angle, you're not really truly able to do the deep work that you could if it's just trauma-informed. Trauma-informed's great, but once again, we're 75 or 80% of the way there.
That's right.
How are we focused?
Yeah. And I love that dedication, because to me, in my experience of working in the field, there has been a focus on so many things other than getting to the root. And
Yeah.
to me, trauma is the root of almost all. I'm not going to be so bold to say all, but it's at least a part of the equation with whether it's addiction or mental health concerns. Most diagnoses have at least part of the root in that. There might be biological issues, but truly trauma is what is at the root of much of this.
Yeah. I mean, it's always been thinking of like this paradigm of nature versus nurture and how much that, brings us to where we are today is nature versus nurture. And really that nurture aspect, when it goes sideways, that's what is trauma.
Yep.
Sure, you mentioned yes, there's genetics, the nature part of it, the genes we have. Well, also the genes we have can dictate the environment that we grow up in. If maybe we inherited some of our mental health issues from family, well, how did those family members show up when we were growing up?
That's right.
And that's how nature is then affecting the nurture. So I would say everything is trauma, more that, who we are today, how we show up in the world, how we interact with others is directly affected with kind of the environment we grew up in.
Yeah.
And if that environment was suboptimal in some ways, or could have been well-intentioned, but things could have gone sideways at different points, that's going to kind of seep into our being. It's not just going to disappear magically. It's going to sit in there and come out in interesting, creative ways as we move and develop through life.
That's right. And I love it because, it's the age-old question that I don't think anyone actually has the answer for, nature and nurture, but we know there's both together create something that I think is profound to work with and to be with, and people are living with this. But the nature aspect the nurture aspect, is so much more, we can work with that one so much more than I think.
We can.
Because I think the idea, especially in the Western medical model, is this must be biological, we fix the biology and everything's fine. I actually had a doctor say to me, why are we going to need treatment programs now that we have medical assisted treatment, right? Just the idea was, well, quote unquote, fix the biology, but we know it's way deeper than that, way more nuanced than that.
Yeah, and this is the frustrating part, especially for an individual suffering from any kind of mental health issue. The difference between behavioral health care and just traditional medical care. Depression isn't like breaking your arm. You break your arm, you get the x-ray, you see what part of it's broken, you get a cast, the cast comes off, and your arm is back to where it was. Treating the brain and treating mental health is this much more vague, amorphous thing that, yes, has to do with neurobiology, but equally has to do with the environment the individual has existed in, is currently existing in, and will in the future exist in. That the cast came off, you left treatment, but that's the small piece of the puzzle is what makes it frustrating. And unfortunately, why relapse rates and stuff like that are very high, post-treatment, because it's not just about the literal care, it's about addressing the root, which is hard to do in a traditional treatment model, as we know.
Well, and since you mentioned it, I think we can dive into the topic of this show, which is Unharmable. I usually lead with that, but the idea that we're healing someone who's broken, like an arm, has been adopted in many circles in behavioral health. There's this person sitting in front of me, they're broken. I'm the clinician. I'm here to diagnose and treat you and ultimately fix that which is broken. And we know that I'll be let's say generous and say that's very limited.
Yes.
I think it actually doesn't work, but I'm going to say it's at very least limited. So what about this idea? Because you and I have an interesting history too with conscious recovery and bringing it into your program when you were a clinical director years ago. What about this idea that our clients aren't inherently broken? And another way to say it is there's a place within them that's never been harmed and is unharmed and unharmable. What difference might that make, and how to look at that through a clinical lens that might be different than my lens, which is more spiritual?
Yeah, with mental health issues, so much of our suffering has to do with our perception of what is going on. Yeah. Yes, there is the underlying thing we are dealing with that can be we talk about trauma, overtly and objectively negative. But our perception of that event can really dictate how much it sits with us. Kind of how I like to talk about it too is there's biological depression, which is like, your brain's not getting enough dopamine. And then there's this wonderful thing that I've termed meta depression, and what it was meta, like I'm depressed about the fact that I'm depressed.
Yeah.
How I view my depression is making me more depressed.
Yes.
Meta anxiety. I'm anxious about the fact that I'm anxious. And if you view yourself as inherently broken, you have the issue, and then your perception of the issue slapped on top of it, which really just makes it, quite literally, if we want to think of it stacking on each other, heavier, more difficult to deal with. And I'm not saying we need to go about life all smiles, butterflies, and rainbows, and everything's great. Terrible things happen to me, and they're wonderful. But, it's how do I keep my perception from of myself weighing me down more than what is already weighing me down from what I'm dealing with or have dealt with.
I love the way you described that. I think that was absolutely brilliant. And it's interesting because I love it when, you and I have different backgrounds. We probably have different perceptions about the world, but we're coming to a very similar conclusion about this.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about it now through like the neuroplasticity of the brain, because we, in general, back in the day, and it wasn't that long ago, we thought the brain was solid.
Yeah.
Right. That's it. The brain is doing what it does.
Yeah.
It's affecting how you experience life. But now we're saying, this is what we collectively are saying, when I change my behavior, I'm changing the brain. But I think it's actually what you're speaking to even more so than the behavior. I say it's consciousness itself, but it's perception.
Yeah.
If I believe that this happened to me, therefore I'm broken, and that's what I believed. I believed I was inherently broken, which is why this is my platform, because healing from that changed everything. And there's not a finish line to that, but healing it enough to say, oh, that's not who I am, that's what I have. It's a point of profound shift. And then that actually starts to change the brain. We can actually start to heal that which felt permanent before.
Yeah. No, if you view yourself as broken, your brain does follow suit. It's like, oh, I guess I'm broken. I will now show up and act a certain way, which solidifies it even more, which makes you feel more broken, which then, and you get stuck in this negative feedback loop. And obviously, like, easier said than done as far as like freeing yourself from the perception you've maybe had of yourself for years, decades, or that has been like imprinted onto you by attachment figures. But it's, really trying to get down to, and this is where like deep trauma work comes in. It's like, what is actually me versus what has been told about me, or what I've told myself about me that has maybe been warped through negative experiences and trauma.
And the important piece here is the most significant, and I'm going to get your clinical opinion on this, but to me, the most significant origin of that is when our brains aren't even developed, when we're really young. So then we think we're going to, quote unquote, fix something cognitively, but there's something so much more. And in the clinical surrounding, we would call it somatic in the body. Spiritually, we would say we're going to drop down deeper into our spiritual essence and start to look at what we absorbed, what was imprinted on us, right? It's far more, and I want to be careful how I say this, it's in the end a bit less important what happened and more important what I decided and absorbed. It doesn't mean what happened is insignificant, it's very significant, but what I decided and absorbed became the operating system.
Exactly.
Then I'm walking around and then it's confirmation bias over and over and over again. I am broken. See, I'm choosing these broken relationships. I don't realize I'm unconsciously choosing them. So how do we start to unravel this from through a trauma lens?
Yeah. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head. Like, you have the traumatic thing happen to you. Yes, that's the overtly negative thing, but that's important. Let's reprocess it. Let's work through it. But truly processing it means, how did that event or series of events or environment I grew up in shape how I looked at myself, shape how I interacted with others, shape how I respond to very unrelated, indirect sort of things?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what PTSD is. It's the trauma, and then fast forward 6 months and more later, it's showing up in this weird kind of creative, indirect way. Yes, it can involve like direct flashbacks and stuff like that, but it's more about what happened to me that was traumatic how it reminds me both consciously and unconsciously of things about myself, things about other people, different people, places, and things. And it really just seeps into our environment in this very unconscious, kind of pervasive and sinister kind of way. You know, how do you unravel it? Easier said than done. But it's really coming into tune and really bringing awareness to how trauma is sneaky. And what I mean by that is it's not just I need to avoid this event again or avoid these people again.
Right.
It has warped my brain in some sort of sense. And how do I bring awareness to being very kind of vigilant of how it can show up in these very subtle ways or very creative ways? You talked about somatic. You know, I've seen trauma show up in the wildest of somatic ways. You know, doing an EMDR session with a client and they start like burping uncontrollably. You know, trauma gets held really weirdly.
It does.
In the body.
And you're saying so many important things. So I want to like kind of continue down the pathway because it is in the body. And when we have these experiences, like I remember early in my healing journey, like my entire 20s when I was in therapy and in recovery and really afraid to look at the trauma. I was running from it through addiction and all these different ways I'd used to escape. And I would get a deep tissue massage and just break down crying.
Yeah.
Right. Like it was literally in the tissue. It was literally stored in there. And yet I was still kind of afraid to look. And the reason that I started Conscious Recovery and the reason that this show is called Unharmable is I think when we start with the possibility, even if it's a possibility, that there's a place that's unharmed and unharmable within every person. Now, I'm talking about the person healing the trauma and also the person that is the clinician or the healer.
Yeah.
Because if I'm looking at my client as broken, they're going to experience themselves as broken even more, right?
Yeah.
So when we create a truly safe place and there's a starting point of what if there's a place that's unharmable, healing or working with that trauma is a really different equation than I'm fundamentally broken.
Yeah. I mean, something I talk to clients a lot about over the years. It's like, you are not your trauma.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be, we're not just talking about trauma. You are not your depression. You are not your anxiety. You're not your bipolar disorder. That, you know, when we've really been suffering, we can become really fused to that suffering.
Yep.
And that suffering can become our identity. And it can become this like thing of, I can't separate out myself from that identity of the one who is broken, suffering, you know, unfixable.
Yeah. What you're saying is so important.
Yeah.
Because as a clinician, to say you are not your bipolar is so powerful. Because honestly, I hear a lot of clinicians referring to their clients that they are that.
Yeah.
They are so bipolar.
Yeah.
And
so borderline, so this,
so borderline.
so that. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that because I was going to give a real life example.
Yeah.
So I have a family member who went to treatment who you may or may not have met, not at Monima, but maybe somewhere else.
Yeah.
And she came out of treatment saying, now I know what's wrong with me. I am bipolar. No, I am borderline. And I'm like, it fits. Like, I acknowledge that it fits. The diagnosis fits. I mean, clearly, like the symptoms are there.
Yeah.
But that cluster of symptoms, and not to get overly technical to the audience, but the DSM is how we diagnose someone, and it's merely by a cluster of symptoms.
Yes.
And so she fit the criteria.
Sure.
But there's a big difference in what you're saying, and it's not semantics, it's profoundly different.
Yeah.
I have this, it's not who I am. And I developed it as a strategy to survive or feel safe. In an environment that for some reason wasn't safe.
Yeah. I mean, the purpose of the DSM in diagnosing, it's not to form someone's identity.
Right.
It's like, okay, can I give this constellation of symptoms just a label so as the provider I can like best provide care and treatment plan? But yeah, it has become warped into this thing of like diagnoses become identities.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're going to view yourself as broken if your whole identity is a series of symptoms.
Right.
You know, the DSM isn't full of positive attributes. Right. Isn't like, you know, dysfunctional interpersonal relationships, chronic suicidality, great sense of humor. Now, that wasn't one of the symptoms of BPD.
Although it could be.
It could be. But, a lot of behavioral health, unfortunately, historically, has come from the place if something is wrong with you, we need to fix it.
Right. And how to navigate, because I want to kind of just really dance in this, because you and I both work in behavioral health, and you also have a license in behavioral health. I at least get to dance in, like, I have this spiritual license, which isn't exactly clinical, so I get to kind of have a little bit different framework, and it gets more accepted. But how to navigate a system that we're really aware, even the insurance companies and all of that, we're really aware that that's the paradigm. And you and I also know that that paradigm can be useful and it can keep someone stuck.
Yes.
And it's both. How do we get to the deeper healing within the system? And I know we are doing it at Monima and at Element Q in a profound way. I'm curious, like, how do you navigate that system? It's like a both and, not an either or kind of.
It is a dance because, diagnosing and formulating people through diagnosing does provide access to care at the end of the day. But I think that's where it's really important to focus in on that they're struggling with this, and struggling isn't a permanent thing. Right. Yes, if you have bipolar disorder, you don't get cured of bipolar disorder. And the way I look at it is any sort of mental health issue is not an on-off switch.
Right.
But it is a volume knob. And we can get this volume of what you're dealing with so low that you don't hear it anymore, that's negatively affecting you. I mean, yes, if you stop taking care of yourself, stop taking medication, start engaging in unhealthy behaviors, the volume gets jacked up again. But it's not like you're constantly suffering. Do you have a predisposition for things to go sideways if not taking care of yourself? Start with bipolar disorder. Sure. Does that mean you're broken? No. I mean, just your brain works in a unique way.
I love it because then we can start to look at the idea is not to eradicate what we call disorder. It's to learn how to be with it in a different way. And what I'm not saying is it's permanent. The best you can do is just deal with it, which is what I hear. I don't hear you saying that, but I hear some people saying that. But it's nuanced because it's like, maybe this thing will always be a part of my experience.
Yeah.
But I've done enough healing now, and I'm speaking for myself, with all my diagnoses I could get. I've never sat down with you and actually gotten my diagnoses, but I have an inkling of some that I could get for sure. Yeah, I know it is.
Don't worry.
I know it is.
Yeah.
And well, let's just name it, right? So like, I could probably get an OCD diagnosis, I'm guessing. I mean, maybe, but there's a benefit to that too.
Yeah,
like
all of them have a benefit to it.
It has served me really well. Yeah. I'm very entrepreneurial. I have these different projects. Like maybe that's ADD. I mean, all the different things. Sure. But to look at it as bad or wrong limits what we're doing, or to get rid of it.
It's a thing. The quote that comes to me a lot is, from Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, you can try to stop the waves or you can learn to surf.
Yeah.
And it's really how kind of I've adopted looking at, I would like to think myself, but also mental health. We're not trying to like stand in the middle of the ocean and go stop waves.
Yeah.
Because that's not going to do anything. We're going to get hit by this gigantic wave over and over and over and over again. Or in that nice little kung fu way, we can work with the resistance and learn to kind of work with this thing.
Right.
And the more you attempt to work with it instead of fight against it, the more you ride the wave, the closer the wave gets to the shore, the smaller it gets, the more manageable it is.
Well, and imagine a world, because I like to imagine a world where everyone's dedicated to learning how to do that in their own life.
Sure.
Because I look at my favorite topic, the topic du jour, the polarization in our world, and I see so much of it in my experience is kind of an outpicturing of unhealed trauma, right? Like, I need the wave to stop so that I can be happy. But the wave is there. And the wave I'm referring to is a group of people who seem to be different than I am or have a different perspective about life or politics or religion.
Yeah.
And this idea of fighting that system, understandable, but it also concretizes it. It also solidifies it. It just makes it more and more polarized. So this analogy of being able to ride the wave is also true with politics, religion, culture.
It doesn't mean rolling over and giving up.
It certainly doesn't.
It's just like, I know both of us, and I say this sarcastically, are huge AA fans here. But like it's the serenity prayer aspect of it, of like parsing out what you can and can't control.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, you know, it's all about control. And when we talk about unharmable and viewing yourself as unharmable, can I control what happened to me? No. But can I control how I perceive myself? To a much more of an extent, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you can perfectly and completely control it, because we have automatic thoughts and feelings and all of that. But how do we work with what we can control?
Yeah.
Instead of trying to fight the big thing, there might be this amorphous, vague kind of thing, this system, or fighting my past, or fighting what's already happened to me. You know, how do I work with it? And what do we know of when we feel like we're in control of a situation? We feel way better. It doesn't feel good to feel out of control. And I would say individuals over-identifying with their struggle, that is them trying to control the situation.
It sure is.
I can't control myself kind of flailing right now in the ocean of my mental health symptoms. But what can I control? If I view myself as broken, I made that choice.
Yeah.
You know, I can control that aspect.
That's
of
right.
it.
And you spoke of the unconscious, which I think is really important. Most of this is unconscious for people.
Almost all of it is.
Yeah, like 99%.
Yeah.
And that's really one of the things we do in treatment. It's one of the things we might do in spiritual community or in support groups, is like bring some of that unconscious into conscious awareness, so that I can start to understand, like, yeah, I have been choosing these scenarios unconsciously over and over and over again because of the core false belief or the core vibration. I'll speak about it in frequency. I will walk into a room and find the situation. That's not to blame the person, because that was my story, Max. I went from blaming the world, also my parents, you know, blaming them, blaming society, to blaming myself. And that was a really dark period. And then when I realized, oh, blame isn't what we're talking about. It's more about awareness and accountability. And even that's tricky, but more like, oh, I have the ability to change this. I don't have to stay in that same story stuck for decades like I was.
Yeah, but that shift's really scary. I mean,
sure
you
is.
blaming parents, blaming the world, blaming yourself, to be your psychologist for a second here, TJ.
Yes, please.
You know, that was you attempting to control the situation.
It sure was.
I can control who I blame, and, you know, how'd that work out for you? Not great, but, you know, here's the thing with the blame. You were leapfrogging from blame to blame because you found, I'll blame these people. Well, that's not enough. So let me stack on this. Well, that's not enough. And I kind of leapfrog on the blame game, and unfortunately, who does it eventually land on?
That's right.
Self.
And the beautiful part about that is I got to really feel what blame felt like. There was this place where I realized that, like, it's not about good, bad, right, wrong. I was stuck in that. It was more about like, oh, I am in this experience of blaming myself, also known as shame. And I felt like I was swimming in oatmeal. And then I started to realize through mentorship, that I didn't come in with that.
No.
And to me, that was pivotal.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't who I was. And I'm repeating what we've already said, but to really understand I didn't come with this means I decided and absorbed. And if I decided and absorbed, I can undecide. And I can start to move beyond this. And then I moved from blame to curiosity. And when that happened, everything changed.
Yeah. I mean, you said already, like, making the unconscious conscious. And, you know, really at the end of the day, that's what psychology is supposed to be. I mean, you know, one of the big foremost, like, founders of what we think of as modern psychology, Sigmund Freud, that was his line. The point of it is, not that I'm a huge Freud fan, but making the unconscious conscious.
Yeah.
It's not about labeling and demonizing, compartmentalizing. It's just coming to this awareness of what's inside of there that I'm not aware of from past experiences, and how can I bring awareness to it instead of letting the unconscious drive the car.
The show.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's, I don't know, you know, it was also Carl Jung had supposedly said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life and we'll call it fate.
Yeah.
And that to me is exactly was the pattern for me. And when like I said, when I went into blaming, and so that has obviously informed the work I do, because I get to hold for someone else something which maybe they've lost contact with, or maybe they don't even have that as a concept. Because I do think in today's culture too, it's like, that person's toxic, I just need to get rid of them. This situation is toxic. And yes, to a degree.
Yeah.
But I have been, like, I actually had someone say that my model, conscious recovery, was victim blaming. Because I was saying it's the core false beliefs and the unconscious ideas and attitudes that create what we call reality. And so I said, well, let's dive into that. The other paradigm is it's their fault. Who has the power? They have the power.
Yeah.
To say, oh, I wonder through curiosity if there are situations in my life where I started deciding these things. And am I unconsciously replicating them? Then I'm taking the power back. I have the power to heal that.
Yeah.
So to me, it's the opposite of victim blaming. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, also that whole like victim blaming kind of idea is this very like black and white theme. Either it's like their fault or my fault, and there's nowhere in the middle. And also, like, can we get rid of the word fault?
Correct.
It's just, what aspect is in my control, what aspect is in their control, and how do I accept what I can't control? And, we're back at the serenity prayer, TJ. The
sure
courage
are.
to like change the things that you can, and once again, the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah. And that wisdom, I mean, it's profound. That's a profound prayer.
It is, yeah.
Because the wisdom is really where I want to live now.
Yeah.
Like what can I affect here? And what can I ultimately affect is me and my perception. I'm just being a little snarky now, but I had someone actually say they feel like conscious recovery isn't really aligned with a lot of clinical principles. Tell me more.
Yeah.
Well, because you're saying life is perception. And if I change my perception, I change what I call reality. But a client who has trauma needs to say it was their fault. And I'm like, well, that could be the first step. But then
Aspect of it, yeah.
like you said, that was it was me trying to heal it by then blaming myself. But deeper healing is, this is still alive within me. And
It's still there.
Incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
Because any of us, I discovered that I could start to shift that.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, a lot of what we think of as PTSD would cease to exist if it was as simple as just blaming the person or thing that traumatized you.
Right.
My job would be really easy.
As would mine.
The person would sit down. I would say, whose fault is it?
Yes.
They would tell me, like, okay, bye. Like, you're curious. It's not as simple as that. Yeah, how does this continue to exist in me and show up in very indirect ways? Because so much of trauma is historical in nature. These people, places, and things that traumatized us, sometimes they're still in our lives, but oftentimes they're not whatsoever.
Well,
or they're in our lives in a wildly different way.
Right. Well, because
than
we're
we were then.
unconsciously replicating. And that's the thing. And that was the point of activation for the person that said I was victim blaming, or saying that once we can get them to say it's their fault, that could be movement.
Yes, sure.
Right. Because
it is helpful so you're not just blaming yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So interesting though, I shifted it the other way. But I remember sitting with a client and, well, actually it wasn't a client. It was back when I was part of 12-Step and I was sponsoring someone, and they couldn't, quote unquote, let go of blaming this person, and the person wasn't even alive.
Yeah.
And I really got at a deep level how the power is being given to someone who will literally never be able to apologize. Right. And that's why I call forgiveness the F word, because it's like, it's so deeply entrenched in good and bad and right and wrong and blame, but making peace with the past is something different. And so I said, what would it feel like and what would it be like to no longer have that person on the hook for this? It doesn't mean what happened is okay or not okay, but when I look at what I've decided and absorbed, then I can that goes back to the serenity prayer. That's where the power lives.
And that's a big trap sometimes with people working through trauma, is feeling like they need to come to this conclusion of like, why? Like, why did this happen to me? Why did this person do this to me? You're trying to have a conversation with maybe a dead person, a person who's not even there, trying to have a conversation with a system of understanding why. And at the end of the day, healing can come from the acceptance of like, I don't know.
I had this really profoundly healing moment recently. I have a very layered relationship with my parents, of course. My dad, who I perceived to be not home, not available, unavailable, not super loving growing up. And I decided and absorbed I was unlovable. And then my sister is like, he was there for dinner every night. Like totally different experience, right? But I knew intellectually, I had an intellectual understanding that my dad had met his father one time. He shook his hand once. But I had this moment when I was in my healing process where I could feel that little boy that was him. Nice to meet you. And I just had this wave of compassion for him. It didn't mean that all that had happened in our relationship was gone at that point, but there was a point of compassion, because I did also like, why did this happen to me? And then I just had this moment where like, I could love my inner child, but I got to love his too.
And all of that came from nothing actually happened.
Right.
It's just your perception of the situation and the person was just shifted. And that can come internally, that can come from some external poking from a mental health professional. But yeah, it's all about perceiving the situation differently, which is both so simple and infinitely complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
At the same time.
It can take a lifetime and it can happen in an instant.
Yes.
Believe it or not, we're almost at the end of our time. I'm wondering if there's anything left for you, or anything present that you want to share, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think just really centering on there doesn't have to be a why. It's just now, what do I do with this? You know, a lot of what I do, I go back to like Viktor Frankl and logotherapy and Man's Search for Meaning, of like when overtly negative things happen to us, we want to find that meaning. And maybe the meaning is there is no meaning, or maybe my meaning in this situation is I'll just continue to search. So like how this has informed my life and what it's taught about. You know, we have to get away in some aspects, especially with trauma, from that like medical model of I need to find the leaky pipe and then fix it. I need to find the broken bone and put the cast on it. It's how do I exist with this thing?
Yeah, and it's sometimes I've even heard people say in addiction recovery circles, I have this hole that only God can fill. That's this idea. But it's more about like, no, I need to learn how to work with it, walk with it, love it, appreciate it, and ultimately heal it.
I said view it with curiosity instead of with judgment.
Look at that. I love it. Thank you, Max. I appreciate it. Max's information will be in the show notes, along with Element Q and Monima's contact info. But I really appreciate this conversation, as I always appreciate our conversations.
Well, thanks for having me, TJ.
Thank you so much, Max.